post it onto our YouTube channel for you guys to have easy access to it. Go ahead and make this. Okay. Okay. All right, I'm going to go ahead and get started. If you guys have any questions, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat box, and I'll take a look at them later on in the presentation. The first section, I'm going to talk about tomatoes, their history and cultivation, and some common problems. And then I'll switch over to Alexa, since she's going to talk to us about preparing tomatoes and preservation and just some typical food safety with tomatoes. So without any further ado, let's get started on tomatoes. So tomatoes are probably the most popular garden crop in America. There are thousands of tomato varieties available. If you guys are familiar with them, they come in a wide variety of colors. You can even get blue and purple tomatoes, yellow, orange, of course, the typical red. There's striped ones. And they're just a lot of different shapes and colors and sizes. So there's tremendous diversity there. They feature in a lot of different cuisines worldwide, which is interesting because, you know, for me, I always think of Italian food features tomatoes so heavily, but tomatoes are not actually from Italy or from Europe. They're from the United States and Mesoamerica. So we'll talk about that in a second. They're technically a berry, although we treat them like a vegetable in our culinary uses. And finally, they're part of the nightshade family, which is Solanaceae, and that includes other plants from the, that includes other plants like eggplant, peppers, tobacco, and those are all a family of plants that is connected to things like horse nettle and some other stuff like that that often has toxic, poisonous leaves. So all the plants in that family have toxins as well, and we'll talk about that a bit more too. So origins and history. Tomatoes are a New World crop. So they originally came from the Andes Mountains regions of South America, and they were cultivated widely throughout Mesoamerica and Central America. They were domesticated by the Aztecs and other Native American groups. So by the 1500s, we had widespread cultivation of the tomato throughout central Mexico and the Andes highlands. So at that time, as Spanish explorers reached the Americas, they encountered a lot of new crops, including corn, squashes, and our nightshade family of peppers and tomatoes. So they brought these seeds back to Europe as they were crossing back and forth through the Columbian Exchange, which is how we got, you know, peppers in India and Thailand, but they're not from there. It's how we got the tomato to Italy. But most Europeans were actually very fearful of the tomato because, like I said, it's in that nightshade family. So many Europeans understood nightshades to be toxic and poisonous. So they didn't really understand that tomatoes were good to eat for a long time. And so they cultivated it as an ornamental plant because they thought it was very pretty. Until about the 1800s. And then people started to experiment with it, especially the Spanish and Italians. They were the early adopters of the tomato and experimented a lot with the tomato as well in their diets. And we can see that today, right? Many recipes from those cuisines feature tomatoes. So interestingly enough, like I said, tomatoes were originally domesticated in Mexico and Central America, and then European explorers took them to Europe, but they were not cultivated in the United States until much later. So they started out probably about the late 1700s. There were some early kind of innovators growing them. Jefferson is one of them. He grew tomatoes at his property, but they were not popular in the United States until the late 1800s, early 1900s as a garden crop. And from then, they've become the most popular garden crop in the United States. It's kind of an interesting evolution there. So another thing that I really want to talk about is there's a lot of different types of tomatoes out there, right? So I did mention that at the beginning that they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes and colors, and there's a lot of variety. But there's also kind of these different categories that we talk about tomatoes here. So I've kind of got pictures here of each one of the four types that I wanted to talk about. So I'll start with paste tomatoes up here. So sometimes they're called sauce tomatoes. Those are typically used for cooking. They're very fleshy. They have very few seeds and very little juice. They're just very meaty. And so they make excellent sauce. And that's what they're used for typically. So some examples of that would be Roma or a San Marzano. Those are kind of some of the main paste tomatoes out there. And as you can see, they're all typically very long and skinny looking. The next one I have is the cherry and grape. So those are typically very abundant, like the plant will produce tons and tons of little tiny fruits. Sometimes they're called pear tomatoes, and they might have a little divot on the top of them that kind of gives them more of a pear shape. Those are typically really fun. I like cherry tomatoes quite a lot. Slicing tomatoes typically have a shape that's globular and they're easily sliced and good for sandwiches, those kinds of things. Very meaty also. And then finally, I've kind of got this as a catch all category, but heirloom, because we talk about heirlooms so frequently with tomatoes. So, heirloom tomatoes can be a lot more unique. They might have kind of a funky flavor. They might have unique characteristics, but you're going to see heirloom varieties of slicers, cherries, and paste tomatoes. So this is just a catch-all for anything that's been an open pollinated original variety. So people get really excited about heirloom tomatoes because they have a lot of flavor. So that's one reason I have this included here. And typically they're an old variety. So I can't remember which one this is. It might be Cherokee Purple, Prudence Purple. A lot of those were developed in the 1800s, along in there. Okay, so you might have also seen these two words, determinate and indeterminate. So if you're at the store, if you're at Lowe's in January and you see those great big seed, um, they're not a stand, but they're kind of like a little end cap thing, display, I guess you could say, and they're just covered with seeds. And you pick up a tomato seed packet and you flip it over, and it gives you some information about the type of tomato. And then at the end of that, it'll say determinate. Well, if you don't know what that means, it's kind of hard to determine if you want that or if you don't. So determinate tomatoes are compact, they're stout, and they will set all of their tomatoes at the same time and ripen simultaneously. So that just means that all the tomatoes that that plant is going to produce, it puts them all out. They all turn red at the same time. They all ripen at the same time. And you can go out there and just pick all of them at once, and then the plant's done. It's not going to produce any more tomatoes. That's it for the whole season. So that may seem like something you don't want, but it's actually really great if you're going to make tomato juice or tomato sauce, because everything you need is ready all at once. So you can go out there, you can harvest them and get them ready to go. And this is used quite extensively in commercial production. So in California, where most of the tomatoes in the United States are grown, they grow only determinate varieties, and it's going to be something like this. It's typically a Roma tomato, and they're harvested with a special machine that goes through and gets them all, and then they're crushed into tomato sauce. It's kind of cool. So then indeterminate is sort of the opposite, right? So that's what most of our typical varieties that you would get at the store or a box store would be an indeterminate, which means that they grow a little bit and they set out some flowers and they produce a few tomatoes. They continue to grow and they produce a few more tomatoes, and they'll continue doing that throughout the entire season until it's killed with frost. So there's kind of an advantage to either. This one will give you a continuous supply, one gives you some that are already at the same time. And then finally, another thing that I just want to mention is disease resistance. And if you've ever tried to grow tomatoes here in Georgia, you've noticed that they often have problems. So if you're, again, let's pretend we're back at Lowe's and it's January and we're looking at our seed packet, you might see on the package something that says, let's say Roma VF. So V means verticillium wilt, and F means fusarium wilt. So it means that it has resistance to those diseases. So if you know that you've had a problem with nematodes, let's say, so you're going to look for something that's nematode resistant, and you might be able to go back in a seed catalog and find something that meets the needs of your particular property. So if you've had diseases on in your area before, it's worth looking into, or just trying to get varieties that have a couple of these letters on there just to give it some extra oomph, some extra protectability there. It's not necessarily always, going to protect against that, but it gives it just a little bit more hardiness. But one thing that I want to caution you against is that giving it that hardiness can sometimes reduce its flavor. So sometimes these more new varieties that are disease resistant don't have the same flavor that those heirlooms do. But you kind of have to pick your battle, because having a tomato that's slightly less flavorful versus no tomatoes, you just kind of have to weigh what's more important for you. Okay, so cultivation. Like I mentioned before, these are a warm weather annual. They are a part of family Solanaceae. So they like those nice balmy temperatures, 70 degrees, and they want 8 hours of sunlight minimum. Okay, so the more sunlight you can give a tomato, the better off you're gonna be. It's gonna produce more, it's gonna ripen quicker, and they just do a lot better that way. So another thing that I would encourage people to do if you have an interest in tomatoes is to grow your own. So you can start them quite easily indoors, about 6 to 8 weeks before that last frost date. So if you don't know your last frost date, you can, of course, it varies from year to year, but you can always go online and put in your zip code and kind of come up with a rough estimate of when your last frost is. So you don't want to plant them too early, but they can be started very easily indoors in those seed trays that you often see at Lowe's or someplace like that. They do germinate very easily. They're not nearly as difficult to start as peppers. But you don't want to plant them too early in the year. You want the nighttime temperatures to be around 50 degrees or higher. Another tip that I would give you all is to plant your seedling, you want it to be planted deeply. So you want that lower portion of the stem to actually be buried, because it will develop roots on that stem. So if you remove those bottom leaves and kind of just plop it down deeper in the ground, that'll help establish a really healthy root system. So that's a good little tip there. And I'm sure everyone on here knows tomatoes do need support to grow. You can grow them without it. Okay. If you remember me talking about the determinate tomatoes in California, when they grow them in big fields, they are not going out there and putting a cage around each one. They're just flopped over on the ground, right? But I don't encourage you to do it just because it can be done. You're going to do a lot better if you give them some kind of support. So either a cage, or you can stake them and tie them to the stake. Woven into a trellis works really well. You can take two stakes out there on either side of a couple of plants and kind of weave some strong twine between them and just kind of tuck the plants in as they get taller. I personally like that method the best because it kind of gives them a flat structure to grow on, makes them easier to pick. So you can get creative with tomatoes, but I do encourage you to use some kind of support with them. And finally, I do encourage you also to allow them to mature on the vine a little bit. You can eat them green if you fry them, but if you pick them, they can ripen easily on a counter or sunny window, but unripe tomatoes should not be stored in the refrigerator just because they will not ripen up. Okay, so I'm just barely going to scratch the surface on this, but there are a lot of diseases and problems that tomatoes have, especially blight. The most important thing I can tell you all is to try to find those disease-resistant cultivars. That's going to give you the most kind of step up on potential problems. Make sure foliage doesn't touch, make sure they're all spaced appropriately. Those are all good ways to prevent disease. But blossom end rot is a problem that we see somewhat frequently, and it's not actually a disease. It's caused from a calcium deficiency. And so what happens is often we have soil that's been really dry, and then we have a big rain, and it sort of affects the plant's ability to uptake that nutrient. And so we see rot on the bottom of the fruits. So that is something you can actually mediate by having a soil test on your garden soil. And that way you'll see if you're having any deficiencies in your nutrient balance, or if you need to add any amendments to get your soil where it needs to be. So finally, the fun stuff. I'm going to give you guys some recommended varieties. I've got a few of them pictured here. So again, remember, determinant is the ones that all come ripe at the same time. Rutgers is a really old heirloom type. It's just kind of like a tried and true. It is sort of like a slicing tomato. You can use it for sauce. Celebrity is another really good one. It's pictured down here in the bottom. Those are both determinant types. Indeterminate, early girl, better boy. We've all seen those at the store. They're really common, typically have a good disease resistance. Cherry tomatoes. Sun Gold is my favorite tomato, so I had to throw it on here. I used to work on an organic farm when I was in high school, and we would grow these, and I kid you not, they're so tasty. We would just eat, probably ate as many of them as went into the bucket when we were picking them. They were so good. So they have a really good flavor. They're a nice yellow tomato. And then Super Sweet 100 is another good little cherry tomato that's got some disease resistance. For the slicers, I've got Jubilee listed. Jubilee is one that's orange fleshed, if you like kind of a orange tomato. Beefsteaks, pretty typical. Mortgage Lifter, that's an old heirloom slicing tomato. For our paste tomatoes, these are really the big hitters. Okay, so these are the ones you're going to see the most often. The San Marzano is kind of like the OG of paste tomatoes. The genetics of San Marzano both went into the Roma and the Amish paste. So these are technically quote unquote improved varieties of the San Marzano. So aroma is what's actually used in commercial production. It's a very prolific, very tried and true variety. And then the Amish paste, like it says, was created by Amish here in the United States in the late 1800s from the San Marzano as well. All three of those are really good if you're going to make sauce. And then just some fun heirlooms. Like I mentioned before, the sky is the limit with tomatoes. You can get them in any shape, any color, just about whatever you're looking for, it's probably out there. But Brandywine is considered one of the heirlooms that has excellent flavor. It's supposed to be one of the best tasting tomatoes. I don't know that I agree, but it is supposed to be. And Mr. Stripey is just a fun one I used to grow. It creates a tomato that has red and yellow kind of alternating colors on the outside, which also show up in the flesh, which you guys can see here. So that's all that I have about tomatoes and cultivation.
Carol, you had a question. Will determinate tomatoes come back next year?
No, they will not. So all tomatoes are annuals. Mm-hmm. Yep. Let's see. And if anybody else has any other questions, you can put them in the chat and I can address them at the end or through chat as Alexis is getting ready.
All right, so I guess we would go ahead and transition to the eating portion or preparing our tomatoes. Let me start my slides. Awesome. And then Carol, if you can make sure you can see my slides well. All right. So my name is Alexis Roberts, and I am the Family and Consumer Sciences Agent with UGA Extension in Fulton County. What is Family and Consumer Sciences? Family and Consumer Sciences is basically the new fancy word for home ec. So I teach classes in nutrition, food preparation and preservation, like we're going to talk about today, healthy housing and financial literacy tier. All right, so let's get into it. So some nutritional background of tomatoes. So tomatoes are a good source of vitamin A and vitamin C. They do contain some natural antioxidants like carotene and lycopene. What's really cool about lycopene is that it's an antioxidant, but in order to us to like really receive it and for the tomato to like emit this antioxidant, it actually has to be cooked. So we don't get as high levels as lycopene from a raw tomato versus a cooked tomato, which is interesting. And tomatoes are a good source of potassium and fiber. And kind of like Carol said, that it is kind of the more popular variety of vegetables kind of in our midst. Kind of in the dietary guidelines, it is suspected that it's one of the most popular vegetables because people put it on their burgers. So kind of fun. Okay, so what do we need to do to prepare our tomatoes? So we always want to make sure that we wash our tomatoes. So we kind of know through history and food safety that tomatoes do have a history of carrying salmonella at times. Not that it's naturally occurring, but sometimes it can be in the soil, it can be on people's hands, or just in the transfer and the production process. So it kind of is a little bit more common with tomatoes. So we do want to make sure that we always wash our produce, especially tomatoes, before we use them. We never want to kind of pull them into a water situation like this. So this is kind of not ideal. Like if there were a colander at the bottom, that would be good. But we don't want the whole sink or the entire bowl to be filled with water. And essentially when the whole thing is filled with water, it allows kind of microorganisms to kind of just spread a little bit more easily versus if it were in a colander type situation or we didn't have a huge sink full. So we always want to make sure after we wash, we discard the stem or we slice or chop. And we're not going to wash our tomatoes until they're ready for use. And then I know there are a lot of like vegetable washes and things like that and vegetable soaps. That's not really necessary for tomatoes. Their skin is so soft that we don't really want to put anything on it. Okay, so a big thing is, do you store your refrigerators after you buy them in the refrigerator or on the counter? So Carol kind of already mentioned this. Essentially, we do just want to, ideally for taste and for flavor, it's going to be better as long as they're not sliced to keep them out on the countertop. So that can be good. We do want to make sure that we keep them away from direct sunlight. But the thing is for food safety, as soon as we chop that tomato, it really needs to go in the refrigerator. It kind of is one of those a little bit more high risk foods for foodborne illnesses. So as soon as we chop it, sometimes when we chop things, we take whatever is on the outside to the inside. And because tomatoes have such a high moisture level and they have a low acidity level, bacteria actually really like tomatoes. So that's why once we chop them, we really want to make sure we get them in the refrigerator. So unripe tomatoes will ripen within 3 to 4 days. And we want to use those ripe tomatoes within about 5 to 6 days. I don't know if anyone's had like a tomato like in the refrigerator, like they can mold like pretty quickly, like within a week sometimes. So want to definitely use those kind of within that time frame. So when we're preparing our tomatoes, it's recommended to use a serrated knife. So like kind of growing up in the kitchen and doing food demos, like I'm always used to using my chef knife. But that is actually not going to be the best knife for me to use when it comes to chopping up my tomatoes. So with a serrated knife, that blade is going to help to create a little bit more of an even cut versus like a chef's knife or something like that. And then Carol kind of already talked about this a little bit, but Roma tomatoes are going to be best for salsas and sauces. And that's because they're a little bit more of like a meatier tomato too. Okay, so cooking. So a lot of times when we get tomatoes from the garden, right, we just get so many and it's like, what do we do with all of these tomatoes? So sometimes I feel like we're like way more creative when it comes to like how to cook meat versus like how to cook our vegetables, right? Like when we make our vegetables, typically it's either like we're steaming it or we're boiling it or maybe sauteing it. But when we think about meat, like, oh, we throw it on the grill or we roast it or we braise it, and we can do the same thing with our vegetables, which are going to elicit a different flavor, which can kind of make it more fun. So we know we can do our fresh vegetables right. We can chop and cut our tomatoes, salad, sandwiches. We can also roast. So roast is when we kind of put something a little bit on a higher heat for a longer period of time. And so we can do that, roast them in the oven. We can also grill them. So when you grill them, you want to cut them in half and let them sit for 30 minutes face down. And then you want to start them on the grill. And then we can also braise them as well. So all of these different cooking methods are going to produce a different flavor and texture too. Okay, so some recipes may call for you to peel your tomatoes. So say if you're doing a sauce or anything like that. And so peeling tomatoes are actually pretty easy. And when done correctly, they come off really well. So what you want to do is you want to start by putting an X kind of at the bottom of your tomato. So it doesn't have to be a super deep cut, but just like an X. And then you're gonna dip it into boiling water. So you're just gonna kind of put it in boiling water for about 30 seconds or so, and you'll kind of see the skin start to blister. So when that happens, you'll take it out of that boiling water and you'll immediately dip it into ice cold water. And then normally you let that maybe sit in for maybe like another 30 seconds. And then when you take it from the ice water, you'll see that the peels just literally like slide right off. And so we'll kind of talk about when you might do this, like in the preservation process too. So when we think about preserving tomatoes, the great thing about tomatoes is that they can be canned, frozen, or dried. So a lot can happen here. So with drying, you can have it in a dehydrator for 100 at 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Typically, they're going to take a little longer to dry because they are so high moisture. You can dry things in your oven if your oven has like, well, some ovens, some new fancy ovens actually have a dehydrator setting. But you really don't want, if you're going to dry something in your oven, for the temperature to go over 180 degrees. And then you have your oven on for like a really long time in order for things to get dry. So if you do decide that you do want to dry tomatoes, it's really important when dehydrating things that before you take it out of the dehydrator or your oven, you want to make sure that it is fully dry. Because what can happen is if there's still a little bit of moisture, it can cause it to mold pretty easily. So you want to make sure it's very, very dehydrated and dry. Okay, so next we're going to go into freezing tomatoes. So I think a lot of times we always think of canning, but there's definitely more to preserving our tomatoes than canning. So with freezing, we can freeze raw tomatoes just by coring and peeling them. So the process we talked about before. You can freeze in whole or kind of smaller pieces. You just want to make sure that you leave some headspace. So headspace is where the food or your food line meets versus kind of the top of the jar or the container that you're using. So you do want a little bit of headspace, about 1 inch, because food can expand or shrink in the freezing process. So we want to give it that airspace to be able to do so. So if I'm going to freeze juice tomatoes, I'm going to wash and I'm going to wash them and I'm going to actually cook them for a little bit for about 5 to 10 minutes. And then I'm going to press them through a sieve or like a colander, right? Just get those juices. Or I can also freeze stewed tomatoes as well. So a lot of different options here. So I do have a slide about canning. Here we go. So I just want to touch on canning because canning is really, I know it's a big thing with tomatoes, definitely for, I feel like the history in Georgia kind of being in the South. So tomatoes are treated as an acid food for canning. So when we think about canning, there are 2 different methods. So we have a water bath canner, or we have kind of this right here, which are going to be for our more acid foods. So water bath canner, or what we call boiling water canning, is when we can kind of in a big pot and the boiling water heats up to 212 degrees, and that's what's going to kill our bacteria and make it safe. And then we have pressure canning, and that's going to be for our more low acid foods. And essentially why that is that bacteria do not like high acid foods. So we don't have to heat it to a super high temperature, versus bacteria loves low acid foods. And there's a certain bacteria that causes botulism that actually can release its spores when it's heated in a low acid environment, which is why we have to heat that to 240 degrees. And we can only do that with a pressure canner. But tomatoes are kind of on that weird line. And so we can still do it in a water bath canner, but we actually need to add an acid to that process. So that is typically taken in the form of like lemon juice from concentrate lemon juice. I know I canned with some people over the years, and I think sometimes traditionally when it came to canning tomatoes, people would heat them up and they would put them in the jar and they would just turn them over, right? And you don't always put it in your canner. And it seals, because things can still seal even if we don't put it in the canner because of heat. But it's going to be really important to make sure that we are actually putting this in the canner, because this is what's going to make it shelf stable and what's going to kill the microorganisms if I put it in the actual canner versus if I just turn it over and it seals, right? That doesn't necessarily make what's inside the product safe. Even though I know that's how people used to do it, but we definitely don't recommend that. We always want to make sure that we use a 2-piece jar system when we do our tomatoes. And we always want to make sure that we get our tomatoes from a evidence-based source. So this is some salsa that I made, I guess it was maybe about a month ago. So canning is a great way to use a large amount of tomatoes or a large amount of things at one time. So this is things that kind of came right out of the garden. So I have tomatoes in here. It took, I think it was about 6 pounds of tomatoes. I think it was about 2 pounds of peppers, has some jalapenos in here, some onions and some garlic. So this was a great way to use my tomatoes. Also just canned tomatoes on their own, very easy to can. And then also tomato sauce as well. And if you're interested in that, we can definitely hook you up with some really great canning recipes. We always want to use evidence-based recipes because canning is a science, and we do want to make sure that we're staying safe. Okay. And then I just wanted to go over some creative recipes when it comes to tomatoes. So kind of like I said, I feel like, we have to think outside the box sometimes. So of course, having a good salsa. So this is a salsa recipe that is for canning. But say if you don't want to can your recipe, you can get really creative and just throw a lot of things together if you're going to refrigerate it. So fried green tomatoes, also an option. I saw this online, a watermelon tomato salad. I thought that was kind of interesting and different. So basil, tomato, mozzarella salad. So just having your basil, your slices of tomato and mozzarella. Making ratatouille takes a few tomatoes. Doing a vegetable pasta salad, marinara sauce, bruschetta, things like that we have up here. Making our own pizza sauce and things like that too. And then once again, you don't even have to can them. You can also freeze them, and those things will freeze really well too. So those are just some ideas of how to utilize those tomatoes when they come in abundance in your garden. Okay. And that was the majority of what I had. Does anyone have any questions?
Alexis, you do have some questions in here. Let's see. Do you have instructions for dehydrating tomatoes safely?
I do. Yeah, I can send that to someone. Yeah. Yeah, I actually have I can put a link in the chat right now. Actually have it up on my computer. Here we go. So yeah, so for dehydrating tomatoes safely, you always want to start with a really good warm, firm tomato. I know we didn't super talk about that. Always want to wash it. And then with dehydrating, it's really important that you, when you slice your tomatoes, that you make sure that they're all the same size. Because right in the dehydrator, it's like when you cook, you want things to like cook evenly. And so you want that same process in the dehydrator, because if you have big pieces and then smaller pieces, some pieces are going to dry faster than others. So you do kind of want to make sure they're the same size. That's really important. And like I said, making sure that they do dry 110%, because you do not want mold. And then normally you can keep something that's dehydrated about 6 to 9 months.
And you also had a question. Why do tomatoes need to be seeded in some recipes?
I would say that, I guess my thought process is just merely for kind of like texture. Like, I don't think it's going to harm it if the seeds are there. But just kind of for evenness and just kind of a texture change or things like that, that you don't want seeds in there, for mouthfeel or things like that. Carol, what do you think? That's my understanding.
Yeah, I think it's probably just a texture, and a lot of times the seeded part can be really juicy. So maybe it's adding too much moisture to your recipe. I'm not really sure either on that one. We did have one other question that said, what tomato is used for sun-dried bottled tomatoes? I'm actually not sure.
I'm not sure on that either. I was trying to look it up. That's a good question. I guess that's a variety. It's really pretty small. I'm not sure. Carol, that might be a you question. I'm not
Yeah,
sure.
I think it's a slicing tomato just based on my personal experience. When I buy sun-dried tomatoes, when you open them up, they're typically like a big flat piece. So I would, if you're gonna do it yourself, I would probably use a like a beef steak or some other kind of similar slicing tomato and just see how that turns out. Probably trial and error. I actually don't know the answer, but I think it is definitely a slicer. Um, and I had a couple of questions and I followed up with people in the chat, but just to talk to you all some more about other problems. A couple of people asked about blight and fungus, and there's not a lot that you can do before anybody kills me on this. If you have something really bad, you can definitely take a picture of it and send it to me, and we can take a look and see if we can get a fungicide recommended for you. There are some products available, but the big things with blight and other fungal pathogens is to make sure you don't water the leaves of the tomato plant. Water right at the base, because we don't want wet leaves. We also don't want the plants touching each other, so keep them spaced appropriately so that air can move around them and there's not so much just, there's plenty of airflow. And if you're growing containers or raised beds, another thing that you can do is replace the soil every couple of years. So just completely like pull out all your soil and dump it out and get fresh, because the pathogens overwinter in that soil. So I just wanted you all to know that. And if you have any more questions about it, I can give you some publications. Let me see. Actually, while we're talking, I think I might just pop that in there. See if I can find it quickly. We have a really good one that kind of goes through some different problems that we see in the, we have two actually. Here's one. I'll put this in. Everyone. There's this one that's specifically about tomatoes, and then we have another one that goes over all other crops and insects. And this one's good too because it shows you a lot of insects. It's kind of like a quick reference guide, and you guys might have an interest in that. And some other people asked, okay, so there was one other question I wanted to talk about. David asked about saving the seeds from his tomato, and if he germinates them next year, will they be true to the original? And this is an excellent question. Okay, so probably not is going to be my answer. Depends on what you grew. So if you went to the store and you bought a tomato such as Better Boy or Early Girl, something like that, those are typically going to be a hybrid, which means they have two different parents. So whenever the seeds come out and they grow from your tomato, they're going to be all over the place. They're not going to be true to like what you had this year. But if you have an open pollinated or an heirloom variety and you didn't grow it around other tomato plants, like if you just grew one plant in a pot or you grew three of the same type and you saved some of the seeds, then you might get a similar tomato the next year. So the genetics on that are kind of interesting, but you'll get something. It may just not be exactly what you had the year before. So I would actually, tomato seeds really cheap. You know, I would just encourage you all to pick some up at the store. That would probably be the best way to guarantee that you're going to get something worthwhile.
Carol, so I looked into the sun-dried. It is typically cherry or grape tomatoes, kind of the smaller kinds, or the Capri. So cool.
Okay.
And then someone else had a question. How do you deal with pest? That will attack.
Yes. And I think she said she wanted natural pest control. So I assume you are talking about insects and fungus. I'm not sure exactly which pest you're talking about, but just in general, kind of follow those same rules that I gave you all for blight, right? Okay, so if you're going to be natural, some of the things that you can do are mulch around the bottom of your plants, because that's going to help suppress rain splashing any kind of fungal pathogens up. Space the plants appropriately. Don't water the foliage. One thing that I find is really helpful is to plant flowers around your garden, such as marigolds and zinnias, because those will attract pollinators and other insects that are predatory. And so they will eat aphids and other small pests like that. Um, Depending on what the insect is, we can give you a recommendation or suggestions if you guys and if you look at I think the second publication that I put out for you guys in the chat, that one has a great it's kind of like a quick reference guide, and it'll show you a picture of the problem and kind of what causes it, how do you take care of it, and just like a really quick, easy to access information. Tums. So I've never heard of anyone using Tums, and is that for insects or for fungus? Not sure on that one. So I don't know anything about Tums as a pest problem solver. So I apologize, I can't give you an answer on that. Oh, for the calcium. Yeah, they would have calcium, yeah. But it'd take a lot of Tums to fix the problem. So I would encourage you. So this fall, if you're for next year, what you would want to do is take a soil test. You can bring to our offices and have it dropped off for $12, and we'll test it for you. And that'll give you a readout of all the nutrients and kind of a profile of what is in your garden soil, and how you need to amend your soil to get it where it needs to be to successfully grow your plants. Okay, so one other person asked about growing marigolds around tomatoes. So I have seen this recommended by many different people. I'm not 100% sure that it's super effective. I think that the goal that they're looking for is to repel nematodes, which are not necessarily a huge problem in the Atlanta area. They are a big problem in South Georgia. Um, so it would really depend. I think you would need a lot of marigolds to be truly effective, but they're attractive and they're going to attract pollinators. So that's a good thing. And other insects, beneficial insects. So I can give you guys an information about soil testing.
Now, someone also asked, is it best to grow tomatoes from seeds or baby plants?
So both are good. So if you, the advantage of seeds is that you can have more options. Everyone. So this is our instructions on taking a soil test for those of you that asked. So growing it from seed just gives you a lot more options and varieties that are available. So if you get a seed catalog, you might have 100 different types of tomatoes you can choose from, or 50 plus. Whereas if you go to Lowe's, you might have 10, the different kinds that you can look at. And that way you can just get more of what you're really looking for. And some people just really like to start stuff from seed. So if you like doing that, I like doing that. It just gives you more options. And yes, I would fertilize or test your soil in your raised beds before you plant in the spring next year. Mm-hmm. Oh, okay. So I'll answer Phil's question first. So regarding seeds, where should we go to get them in any particular brand? So there are a lot of different seed companies out there, and sometimes you will see that they're coated, that the seeds are coated. So there's not a particular brand that I recommend. I think if you're going to start seeds, I would get one like Fairy Morse or Burpee or High Mowing, something like that. All those are really good. They're all certified. Anything that you buy in a store is going to be certified, is going to be ready to go. But you will see sometimes that they have a seed coating, and that's typically to help you make sure that the coat, because seeds are so small, can help you to handle the seed to get it directly into the soil like you need it to be. And also, typically those have a little bit of a fungicide and possibly a fertilizer or something to encourage the seed to grow successfully. As far as all the rain not a lot you can do really with that. You can just, I mean, depending on how many plants you have, you can bring them in. Maybe if you have them in pots, something like that. But there's not a lot you can do with weather, is out of our control. Um, I think this is about all the questions. I did see one about deer, and there's nothing you can do to protect against deer, really, except for fencing. The only guarantee is an 8-foot fence around your property, and most people just don't have that, and it's kind of overkill. I have heard if you're out in the country and you have property and you have a garden and they're constantly a problem, I have heard from some of the vegetable specialists here at UGA that you can use 2 lines of electric fencing. If that's something that you have available to you at your home. And if they'll do them at 2 different heights and they'll keep one low to the ground, like about 18 inches. Deer have very poor vision and they don't like to stumble upon something. So if they get close to it, it can confuse them. And that is supposedly an effective method. But really, fencing is the only thing to prevent deer. So, okay. So we've had some more gardening questions. Let's see, brown spots on your stem is likely a blight. There's not a lot you can do. You can send me a picture of it and we could take a look and maybe get an idea of what's going on. And maybe we can come up with a better solution. But once you start to see the symptoms, there's not a lot you can do to prevent it. Somebody's got a question about square foot gardening. And Phyllis says she's had success with liquid fence for her deer. I don't know anything personally about deer repellents. I've not seen any literature on it that says it's effective. If you have success with it, go for it because they're a huge problem. But fencing is the only way to really guarantee it. Alexis, do you see any other ones that I didn't cover?
No, I think you got them from
Most of them. And everyone, I'm just going to go ahead and type my email address back here again. And if you guys have any questions, oh, Julia asked one. This will be my final question from Julia tonight. So it says, is it best to start my own compost or use store-bought fertilizers? So this is up to you. Again, if you are growing in containers and you're using potting soil of some form, it's likely amended enough already that you don't need additional fertilizer compost. It's always a good thing to make your own compost at home because that's reducing your food waste. It's using your food waste and it's kind of making less garbage for you, but it doesn't necessarily make fertilizer. Okay, so compost typically that we make in our own homes is very low in nutrients. So it can kind of condition your soil and improve the texture of your soil, but it doesn't necessarily add nutrients. Even if you do a really great job, it's just only adding a little bit. So you can do it as much as you like. It's not going to hurt anything. So that's fine. But if you have a big garden, I would definitely encourage you to soil test so that you can get a recommendation of what needs to be amended there. And go for David has one. Okay, David, you're the final question. Eggplant. Probably it's flea beetles, and it won't. If it's a really tiny holes, they will make it look not attractive, but they probably will not affect the yield of your eggplant. You should still get plenty off that. So that's all that I have. Again, you guys are more than welcome to send me questions about your tomatoes and pictures of them, and we can take a look. And thank you so much for tuning in tonight and watching us and just getting information about gardening and preserving your tomatoes. So I'm going to stop our recording.
Yes, thank you, everyone. Have a good night. And I'll also put my email